Hi, everybody. So we're going to talk about the immune system a little bit. As I've sort of expressed in the past, this would be material that you would typically sort of cover throughout the early material if you were following the AP version of the course. I think it's just a little dense to have mixed in with cell signaling and cell cycle and that kind of stuff, so I've always chosen to do it separately. So what I've been able to do is pare this back a little bit, removed a little bit from it that I don't think is necessary. And this is just providing us some real life examples of cells communicating with each other, and some other pieces that could show up on our exam. Now, I would not expect a lot of heavy detail to show up in this year's exam because it's such a short test. But I think they could definitely frame a question in the immune system. And so a little bit of background knowledge about it will help you to be able to make sense of that kind of question. I've also left a couple things in here too that I just think are interesting, or that I think are just really good knowledge to have. I think too many people are not well educated in their immune system and how it works, and so we'll kind of achieve that purpose as well. But I'll probably kind of say when we're looking at a slide or a piece of information that I don't think is important to think about for the exam. So the key here, we got a couple essential questions on this slide, but the big key is this first one, asking how does our body defend against pathogens, right, or infectious disease agents. This is also very, very current to what we're dealing with right now. But then also we're going to look at this difference between the types of immunity. And again, we're not going to get into a lot of depth in the immune system itself, but more just looking at the types of cells and the interactions that those cells have with each other. So when we talk about the immune system, a lot of times they talk about it like it's a military or something of that nature. So I put up here the living Department of Defense. And what your cells are trying to do is to recognize an invader, right, recognize a pathogen, and then respond to that pathogen. And what you might not realize is that this involves a lot of cell signaling, right? Recognition is performed essentially by receptors on the cell surface binding to a pathogen and recognizing it for what it is. And then the response is a sort of a trickle-down effect as this cell communicates with that cell to mount this immune reaction and hopefully get rid of that invader. Now, the way that we do that is essentially the mobilization of white blood cells. Right? White blood cells are your key components of your immune system, and you guys probably already knew that ahead of time. But then we can break the immune system down into two big parts. We've got what's called your innate immunity. Sometimes, depending on the textbook you look at, we also see this referred to as natural immunity or non-specific immunity. And all of these names are good for this part of your immune system. Innate means born with. Right? So innate immunity is present at birth. It will defend against any and all foreign invaders. Therefore, it is non-specific. Right? Any kind of pathogen or invader that shows up, it will attack. And it's active immediately when you get infected. In fact, it's active at all times. So it's active even when you aren't infected by a pathogen. Now, then you've got adaptive immunity. Now, the adaptive immunity is what's a little more specific to us, right? Adaptive immunity is only found in vertebrates, and so more complex animals. Sometimes adaptive immunity is also referred to as acquired or specific. And again, these are all good names for it. This is the part of your immune system that develops over time, right? So this gets better and better as you grow, and it defends against very specific invaders. So it is a defense against these previously identified pathogens that make a return to your body. I added a couple pictures here just from the quarantine. I forgot to mention on that first slide too, that was baby Charlotte when we had her little baby jail that we would trap her in. So that was her little quarantine years ago. But a friend of mine sews a lot and knows that my wife is a nurse. And so she actually made us some of these homemade masks. She did a Spider-Man one and a Rapunzel or Tangled one. So this is us the other day, just trying them out. That friend actually, her dad owns an ice cream joint here in Indiana, so I was actually able to hit a drive-through and get a really good milkshake and pick up some masks for us. I got annoyed with my hair, so I buzzed all my hair off. That was something I could do one day for fun. And then Eric and I have been battling lots of imaginary bad guys with his toy swords and shields and stuff. And then this is a picture of my brother that he sent me from up in northern Indiana. It's still a little colder up there, but that's my brother and my niece there, Lucy. So here we go. So if we break this immune system down again, we've got sort of these two branches of it. And if you look at this bubble up here first, we've got the pathogens, right? Things that cause disease. So it might be bacteria, might be fungi, might be viruses, might also be parasites or something like that. And you've got all these different defense mechanisms that try to stop them, right? So we can kind of think of it like, here's your body down here. And so all these layers of defense are there to try to keep the pathogens from getting in there and causing an infection. So all animals have this innate system, which defends against all kinds of pathogens. It involves basically barriers and then also like cellular defenses, which is what this part is down here. Then you've got your adaptive immunity again. This involves two responses itself, a humoral and a cell-mediated response. And we'll break both of those things down again too, but remember this is the more specific part of your immune system. And then here's my version of this picture. This probably looks familiar if you guys had biomed with me, because I used this in that course as well. But again, your innate system broken into kind of two pathways, and then under each of those you've got more levels of organization. So on the innate side you've got those defenses and you've got cells, and on the adaptive side you've got the humoral response and the cell-mediated response. Well, this slide we're going to go through very quickly because your innate immunity begins with barrier defenses, right? What the innate immune system does is it recognizes traits that are common to all pathogens, basically, right? So it is just a way to keep everything out. So barrier defenses, if we think about our school, right, if we were trying to sort of increase security at the school, one thing we could do is we could put a big fence around the whole school, right? And that fence theoretically would keep everybody out that isn't supposed to get in. It's kind of like why you might put a big fence or a big wall around a prison, right? You got to go through a guard station, and if you're not, kind of qualified to get in there, you don't get in. And that's kind of what this first line of defense is. But again, this isn't something that's very cellular, and so we're not going to spend that much time with it. But this includes your kind of external barriers, right? So here's a really cute picture of Charlotte when she was a baby. I think she does have a diaper on here, but the skin, or in the case of insects, the exoskeleton are good defenses. You've got mucous membranes in places where your skin opens. So like on your eyes and your nose and your mouth, you've got mucus that's there to help keep things out. And then you also create enzymes that you secrete, right? So sweat, tears, saliva, they're going to have these enzymes that'll break things down as well. And the side we want to look at a little bit more, again, is this sort of cellular response side. And so innate immunity also involves some cells. And again, these are non-specific, but if a pathogen is able to breach your barrier, so if you have a cut on your hand and the pathogens can get in, then you have a line of cells ready there that are, again, non-specific. They're going to just try to destroy anything that's foreign to your body. So again, keep our analogy going. Let's say we erect this fence around the school, and then we just have some, security guard people whose job it is to keep everyone out that shouldn't be there. So if someone were to get through the fence, we'd have some people specifically there as security guards who would help get rid of them. Now, the main way that the innate system uses cells is through phagocytosis. And I hope this sounds a little bit familiar. Phagocytosis we mentioned a long time ago, I think back with diffusion and osmosis. This is a way to bring large things into the cell, right? So it's the cellular ingestion of pathogens. So we've got this big cell here This is called a monocyte or a macrophage, and we'll have that on a slide here in a moment, that is able to do phagocytosis and bring in these pathogens into the cell. And then once it brings them in, it will merge the little vesicle with those pathogens with some enzymes that will break down those pathogens, right? And then it can just release the debris here, right? This is just dead parts of bacteria or whatever. Now, this is performed by something called a TLR, a toll-like receptor. So toll-like receptors are found on the outside of these, maybe they're shaped something like this, right? Found on the outside of these phagocytic cells, and they bind to a pathogen. And when they bind to a pathogen, that sort of triggers this response that brings it into the organism. And so it is performed by something called a hemocyte in insects. And then, as I mentioned a second ago, we'll see some cell names here in a moment for animals like us. So we have several different phagocytic cells that can function in our body. The first one is what I mentioned a moment ago called a macrophage, and this is probably the most likely thing you might see if this were to appear on the AP exam. Macrophage, as pictured here, are these large cells that literally means big eater if we look at the Greek roots. And so these are found in organs and tissues. So they're sort of kind of circulating through your bloodstream and through your body tissues, looking for potential foreign agents that they can basically swallow up, right, and break down. And a lot of times we call them monocytes if they're in your bloodstream, but then once they're out in the tissues, we call them macrophages. Then we have things called neutrophils. That's what's pictured here. They have this unique multi-lobed nucleus. These circulate in your bloodstream, are kind of will randomly pick up invaders, but they'll also be brought in huge numbers if there is an infection in the tissue. If there's an infection in the tissue, it releases some sort of signal, and that signal brings more neutrophils to the site. You've got something called a dendritic cell, which I don't have a picture of, that are found kind of just under your skin. And then you've got these things called eosinophils, which have these hourglass-looking nuclei, and they have these dark red granules all over. And eosinophils, are found kind of circulating through the body. They are slightly phagocytic, so they can engulf foreign invaders. But more so what they do is they release destructive enzymes from those little red vesicles, and those enzymes will try to kill any kind of invader they find. And so these are really involved in parasitic infection. So if you ever have a patient, and if you're a medical worker and you see a high number of eosinophils in their blood work, that's an indication that they might have a multicellular infection, which is creepy to think about, but that's something, maybe something more like a tapeworm or something like that. And I put this side note, a lot of times people don't even think about, we have a lymphatic system, which is what all these green vessels are in this picture, which kind of runs along with our circulatory system, our bloodstream, but carries basically essential immune pieces. It's sort of like a sewer system inside your body when compared to your bloodstream. A couple other human specializations. I don't think this will really matter though, so we'll kind of skip over it. But you've got some cool kind of cells that are like mercenaries, just go out and kill stuff. You got some special defenses against viruses, and you make something called complement, which is a group of proteins which are again specific to humans and help you to break down pathogens. Another thing that you probably don't need a whole lot about for AP, but is interesting, is inflammation. What we call the inflammatory response. Now, inflammation comes from the Latin word inflammare, which means to set on fire. And they called it this because when you saw an inflammatory response, you saw people's skin become red and warm and kind of puffy. And this, as it says here, is the general response to tissue damage. So notice that inflammation isn't even necessarily specific to infections. If you damage your tissue in any way, you can get an inflammatory response. So if you twist your ankle, you'll get an inflammatory response at that ankle, which again causes redness and swelling and that sort of thing. And what happens is when you see tissue damage, you get some signaling molecules. So we have seen this as an example before on an AP test. I believe it was multiple choice, so it might not apply to us this year. But what happens is if we damage the tissue, so let's say you get a big splinter like you see in this picture, and not only is this splinter itself damaging the skin and damaging the tissue just beneath, think about all the bacteria that are riding that splinter into your skin, right? And so it forms an opening in that barrier where you might be able to get infectious agents in there. So what happens is you've got these cells called basophils, or there's a really similar cell called mast cells. And as soon as they detect this sort of damage, they release histamine. Now, if that sounds familiar to you, it's probably because you've heard of antihistamine drugs, right, which are given for allergies, and we'll come back to that later. But basically, these cells detect tissue damage, release histamine. This histamine is a signaling molecule, right, which binds with blood vessels and causes them to dilate or open up, right, and it causes more permeable blood vessels. So cells can basically get in and out of your bloodstream. Now, once the immune cells start to show up, because you've got this increased blood flow, right? You dilate the blood vessel, so more blood comes to that area. Immune cells show up and they start to release other signals called cytokines. And cytokines, think about that for a second, right? Cyto means cell, kine is sort of indicating movement, right? So these are released by cells and they cause cell movement to this area, right? So you continue to increase blood flow and immune cells in that area. Now, you get all these immune cells showing up, you got increased blood flow, you got increased fluid, so you get redness, warmth, and swelling. And so what happens is, you bring on these phagocytic cells, which can eat any kind of invaders that might be in there. You make these other things, like we mentioned, the complement protein in the case of humans. And this all leads to this accumulation of pus, a whitish fluid that is sort of evidence that your immune system is working. A little bit of inflammation, right, a controlled inflammation, and a little bit of pus is not necessarily a bad thing. It's a sign that your body is working to defend itself. Now, if you have out of control inflammation that spreads, a whole lot of pus buildup, excessive swelling, those kind of things, then you have to start worrying a little bit more. Now, just a moment to mention that I don't want to go through this slide exhaustively, but again, this is sort of the cellular look of what would happen if that splinter breaches the skin. And notice the little green bacteria that rode the splinter through the skin. When you have a minor injury, you should get short-term localized inflammation, right? So it does not last very long, and it's found in one place, and this is a really good thing. And that occurs when, you've got, again, these cells release histamine. These cells are here to do phagocytosis. They send all these cytokines out so that other immune cells will start to show up, and they clean everything up. This is good, and again, it should be short-lived. The problem is that a serious injury or a serious infection can lead to systemic inflammation. This is... again, at the surface, not the worst thing in the world. This leads to signs that sort of indicate that you're sick, but if it goes on too long or if it's too strong of a reaction, we call it sepsis, right? And that can be life-threatening. And then for some people too, they have chronic inflammation. There are diseases that lead to chronic inflammation that we'll mention here a little bit later as well, but this is usually because the body's immune system is attacking itself, leads to inflammation that never goes away, and that itself can cause damage to the tissue. Also got our first little video break for the day. If you've never seen these Saw movies, it might not be as funny to you, but the video cracks me up. And if you think it is funny, you can also look up Working with Jigsaw, which is almost just as funny as the one that I posted. Okay, now to the slightly more complicated side, which is your adaptive immunity. And so this is the part of your immune system that develops over time, and it develops against specific invaders. Now, the adaptive immunity is all the responsibility of your lymphocytes, which are your B cells or your T cells. Now, both of these are made in the bone marrow. B cells will fully mature there, while T cells go to a little tiny organ called your thymus, where they will fully develop. Interesting thing is that even the greatest, pathologists in the world, they couldn't tell you if this picture was a B or a T cell. They look exactly the same under the microscope. Now, before we move forward, I just want to take a moment to make sure you're good with a couple different vocab terms. The first is antigen. All right, so an antigen is any kind of foreign substance that leads to an adaptive immune response. So it's any kind of foreign thing that comes into your body that your B or T cells will respond to. And the way they do that, again, here's a good specific example of something kind of from our past, is receptors. Right? They have antigen receptors pictured here. They show these B cell receptors kind of looking like Y's, and these T cell receptors kind of looking more like H's or U's, I guess. These are really specific. So again, we're talking adaptive immunity now. So this is your specific immunity. So you actually make millions of types of B cells and T cells, because each of them has one specific receptor on its surface. So for instance, like this is a B cell for, the chickenpox virus, which is called varicella zoster virus. So its receptors are specific to that pathogen. And so again, this does mean that you have to make a ton of different types of B and T cells to be prepared for all those different pathogens that might come into your body. Now, what a B cell does, right, is it will recognize antigens. So here we go again. Antigen is anything that the body responds to. So it might be like a protein here on the surface of a pathogen. When a B cell comes into contact with this, its receptor binds to the antigen, and then the B cells begin to create a soluble form of the receptor. And these are called antibodies. Now, in medical school, these are referred to as immunoglobulins. So you gotta know that more specific term if you decide to go down that path. But for now, we just call these antibodies, and you've maybe heard this before. But again, notice the difference between these terms, right? Antigens are foreign, while antibodies are made by your body, all right, made by you. And these antibody proteins help defend you against pathogens. So it's not that the B cell is really doing anything to the pathogen, it's that the antibodies are going to do something to attack the pathogen. Now T cells, it's very similar, except T cells do not usually interact with the pathogen itself. So I'm going to put here, not usually directly with pathogen. What happens instead is one of these phagocytic cells will catch a bad guy. All right, so maybe it's a macrophage. It does phagocytosis, eats this pathogen, and then it's got something called an MHC, or major histocompatibility complex. That's a mouthful, right? But an MHC is basically just a modified receptor that presents antigens. So what you see on this picture, right, what's happened here, change my color, is the MHC molecule has now taken a piece of the pathogen and it has presented it. And there, what we see happen is this T cell comes along, binds up, and the macrophage is like, hey, dude, check it out, right? And this molecule shows the T cell this antigen. So it's just another kind of step in this receptor pathway, right? That we have sort of one modified receptor which puts out this flag, and then the other receptor binds to it and recognizes it, and that's what that T cell receptor is doing. Now, a couple just odds and ends about B and T cells. Don't have to know these too much, so we'll go quick. There's both my babies wearing their adventure hats or something, I guess, years ago. First thing is they use genetic recombination a lot. So we've seen this as a potential way to ask a question about like crossing over, right? Is that we do genetic recombination, right, or crossing over, and don't forget that was during meiosis, and this can lead to a huge diversity of B and T cells. Again, remember, you've got to have a ton of these in your body because each of them has a unique and specific antigen they recognize. So the way you get all that diversity or that variation is through meiosis and through variation. I should go back. It's not meiosis, right? Because it's not making sex cells. So let's get rid of this. It's a similar process that we would see in mitosis. But big key, think crossing over. All right, this is just like crossing over that we have in our cells. Now, the second thing that's kind of interesting is the only immune cells that should be allowed to mature are ones that are self-tolerant. So sometimes they accidentally make, through this genetic recombination, a cell that will attack the self. Right? Now that's a big oops, right? And so what happens is you get rid of that cell. Right, that cell is destroyed via apoptosis that we talked about earlier this year, and you get rid of those. Again, we'll come back in a few minutes and talk about how sometimes that doesn't happen in people, but it should. So all of us that have like a normal functioning immune system, if you or when you randomly make these ones that attack you, your body gets rid of them and you don't have to worry about them anymore. The other thing that is a term that we might have to know, I'm really not sure, is clonal selection. Clonal selection basically means that you've got all these different types of B cells, right? So I'm gonna use a couple different colors here and draw these B cells. Now, when a pathogen comes into your body, right? So we'll draw just this little bug-looking thing here. So a pathogen comes into your body, and whichever B cell is supposed to respond to it. So let's say it binds with the receptor on this yellow B cell. Well, what your body starts to do is it starts to clone this B cell. Right? So I call it clonal selection. So you make a ton of these guys, and the B cells will be able to then, really attack and get rid of this pathogen. Now, once the cells are clonally selected and you make a bunch of them, they can kind of fall down one or two paths. They can be effector cells, which are cells that kind of actively get rid of an infection, or they can be memory cells, which are really important to allow us to adapt, right? To allow us to remember, so to speak, a pathogen that's been in your body before. So here's a picture. I guess I wasted my time drawing that. Here's a picture of B cell clonal selection. All right, so you got these little pathogens here that come into your body. They specifically bind to this type of B cell and not these others. And again, that kind of harkens back to what we learned about receptors and things before too. They got to have the right shape, right? Notice how these shapes kind of go together, whereas it wouldn't fit with that one or that one. And then once this thing gets activated, we do clonal selection. We make a ton of these B cells. Now the last thing, and we'll come back to this here in a minute too, I love this picture of Charlotte in her little robe when she was a baby, but the way this picture took, it looked like she was a ninja. B and T cells both can come as memory cells. And memory cells are sort of like the hallmark of adaptive immunity. We call it immunological memory, right? The ability of cells in your body to sort of be prepared for the return of an infectious agent. And again, without going into too much depth here, although I want to because I love this stuff, your body has a primary response, which would be when your body is exposed to an antigen for the first time. It usually takes you a good half of a month, right, to mount a good response against something that you haven't had before. And so maybe the first few days of that infection, you feel fine as the virus or the bacteria kind of multiplies inside you. And then you've got a few days where you feel sick, and then you start to get better, and you got a few days where it's kind of still around, but you're functional again. And all in all, that might be something like 15 days, right? But a secondary immune response is a response to an antigen that you've seen before, that your body's aware of. And so in this case, your body mounts a response that reaches peak efficiency in 2 to 7 days. And that response is stronger, and that response lasts longer. And the key is you rarely ever know that you were infected. So if you get a pathogen, and it has to be the same exact one, right? But if you get a pathogen for a second time in your life or a third time in your life, it's going to start to multiply in your body. And before you ever even feel any symptoms, your body's going to get rid of it. All right, and so then you don't get sick from that again. And there are some diseases that are famously like this, or like chickenpox, which I know most of you guys probably got a shot to defend against. But people get chickenpox once, and they won't really get chickenpox that specifically again because the secondary response is strong enough. And this is all because of these memory cells that your body creates. Random but pertinent side note, realize with this coronavirus we're dealing with, they're calling this a novel coronavirus, right? It's a type of that virus that we have never seen before on our planet, which means not a single human on the planet had immunity to it when it started back late last year, meaning that any of us that engage with this, COVID-19 is the disease. SARS-CoV-2 is the specific name of the virus. For us, it has to be a primary immune response. So you will get sick from it because you haven't possibly crossed paths with it before now. Now, these two responses of the immune system, or the adaptive immune system, require a lot of cell communication, right? The cell-mediated response is pretty much just a T cell response, and it goes out and it destroys the pathogen. The humoral response involves both B and T cells, and it relies on those antibodies that we mentioned earlier. And this occurs sort of within the fluids, is what scientists would say, and so that's why we call it humoral. Humors just basically mean fluids of the body. Now, both of these start with helper T cells. Now, helper T cells are oftentimes referred to as the Paul Revere of the body. So I don't think I can draw Paul Revere. I wish I could. He probably doesn't wear a coonskin cap, right? He wears like some sort of military cap or something. This is just getting worse and worse. And he probably has a little goatee. But Paul Revere, right? I don't know the history very well. You can ask Miss Kramer about that. But Paul Revere sort of like alerted everyone that the redcoats were coming, right? And sort of initiated the response. And this is what helper T cells do. So earlier we had that picture of the macrophage, right? And it ate the pathogen, and then it used that MHC molecule to present the pathogen to a T cell. Now, in this case, that T cell is actually a helper T cell. So the helper T cell is notified by the macrophage, like I put here, look at what I found. And that alerts the helper T cell that, hey, there's a problem, right? There are pathogens in our midst. And then another option is sometimes an infected cell will alert a helper T cell. So again, this is kind of like throwing up a red flag, like, dude, there's something bad inside of me right now. And so this infected cell, forms some sort of receptor response with a T cell and alerts things. And the T cell goes out there like Paul Revere and it tells everyone else, including all those other immune system cells, guys, there is a pathogenic invasion going on. So back to my little school analogy again. Let's say that, I don't want this to get too creepy, but let's say we put up our fence to try to keep people out, and we've got our security guards and stuff, but then we become aware of a particular person who wants to come into Mercy and cause harm for some reason. Well, if that happens now, we all know, at least your teachers would know who is this specific dangerous person, and we would know to keep an eye out for him. And if we were to find that person or see that person somewhere, right? Let's say I'm teaching and I look out the window and I notice this dude is out on the lawn. Well, then I'm gonna, press the alert button, call call the office, whatever, to alert everyone else of what's going on. And in that case, that specific guy might be a pathogen, and I would be acting like a helper T cell and alerting everyone else. So this is what this would look like. This is a great picture. Again, the details of it, I have no clue if we'll really need, so don't spend too much time worrying about it. But, again, we got this macrophage here that will engulf a pathogen. It will then present that antigen on its MHC molecule. Our helper T cell here will then activate, and it will release cytokines, right? It will release these chemical messengers, which will basically lead to both responses. I know we haven't really detailed them yet, but the helper T cell will activate what's called a cytotoxic T cell to cause cell-mediated responses, and it will activate B cells to cause humoral responses. So again, this is our little dude, Paul Revere, telling everybody, wake up, we got a problem. Now the cell-mediated side is simple. Again, I'm going to circle it here. This involves cell signaling, right? In the cell-mediated response, helper T cells will alert cytotoxic T cells. Obviously, cytotoxic meaning cell toxic or cell, death, basically. These cytotoxic T cells, which is what this would be right here. All right, so cyto T. They can bind with the pathogen, and they can cause actually, I should kind of back up. They can bind with the pathogen, or what we're seeing here in this picture is they're binding with a body cell that is infected. All right, and so what they do is they release enzymes that actually can poke holes in the cell. Basically, they cause the breakdown of an infected cell, and it'll destroy the pathogen in the process. Or they can directly bind with a pathogen, and they can cause it to die as well. Now, the humoral response is a little bit different. Right? Humoral response, again, you've got helper T cells that are going to release cytokines and activate B cells. But what this will do is cause the B cells to become a couple different things. It'll cause them to become plasma cells, which essentially just make a whole bunch of antibodies, which again, antibodies can bind to and help destroy pathogens. And so it's almost like it turns into a little factory, all right? So this B cell, when it gets activated by a T cell, it becomes, I don't know how to draw a factory. It becomes, there we go, smokestack. It becomes this factory that makes a whole bunch of antibodies. And again, this is not a detail you need to know, but antibodies can come in 5 different types. We got immunoglobulins, G, A, M, E, and D, which kind of respond in different ways to different things. Now, in either case, we've got immunological memory, right? So some of those plasma cells will become memory B cells. Some of those effector cells on the T side will become memory T cells. And these, again, will remember that specific pathogen. So if it ever comes back, they'll be ready for it, right? So essentially, I always like to tell a story in my classes about plants or factories that still exist in the U.S. right now. When we were at wartime, specifically going back to World War II, they erected these factories or plants all over the country to help build ammunition and things like that. And typically those plants were built kind of off the beaten path not in places where an enemy would think to go destroy those factories. So there were several factories around our area, in the southern Indiana area. And the crazy thing is that some of those factories, even though they've been allowed to kind of become decrepit on the outside, are still fully functional if we would need them, right? So again, not that there is a factory in my backyard right now creating bullets or jet planes or whatever. Shoot, we need them to be making ventilators and hospital masks. But there's these factories. One of the more known ones around here is around where that Amazon fulfillment center was built, about 10 years ago here in southern Indiana. But these munition plants, and if we ever went into a full-scale, kind of wartime situation, we could immediately have that factory functional again. We wouldn't have to take the time to build the factory and that sort of thing. And that's basically what your body does, right? It keeps some of these memory B cells, some of these factories around, and so as soon as a pathogen comes back, boom, we can be back in production. We can be making antibodies to defeat it, and our memory T cells can wake up and immediately become cytotoxic and go out and kill that invader if it comes back. Now, a couple odds and ends. Another video break in there for you. This is a short one. I don't even know if you guys remember Kmart, but it was a store kind of like Target, right? That went under. But as they were starting to go under, they did a bunch of online commercials that really kind of pushed the envelope a little bit. Maybe not the kind of thing you'd see on regular TV. And some of them were really funny. And so this is a little YouTube video of one of these old Kmart commercials that came out that my brother and I found to be really hilarious when it first came out. And maybe, me, I would show it at school, but maybe not the most appropriate for school either. Now, a couple things that, again, I do not think are going to really show up on the AP exam. Okay, so if on your notes you want to just kind of get rid of this slide, that's totally fine. But the first thing I wanted to point out is that everything we're talking about is what we would refer to as active immunity. But you can also receive passive immunity as well, right? We can give someone antibodies that will help to protect them. And this is basically how the immune system works for a developing baby inside of its mother, right? The mother's immune system is not only protecting her, but it's protecting her growing baby inside as well. And then this is why a lot of people advocate for breastfeeding. And so that's why I didn't want to just completely take this out. I don't want to make you uncomfortable. But some people are not able to breastfeed, and that just happens. But if you choose to have kids one day, I hope that you would give some serious thought into trying to breastfeed your child, because there's a lot of different benefits that have been tracked and shown to be there for the baby. But one of the big things is that particularly antibodies called IgAs, immunoglobulin A, are really good at passive immunity, and so they help the kid not get sick so much. And so I can just tell you, my wife breastfed with both of our kids. Both of them were pretty healthy babies, didn't get a whole lot of infections or sick and stuff. One of her friends, Katie, was just not physically able to breastfeed her two kids. And they actually have a third on the way. And those kids, they just constantly had runny noses and whatever. And so that's not a scientific study. That's a really small sample size, but it tends to work. So just kind of to know that is a good thing, I think. Another thing that I do not expect to be on the AP exam, but I find to be pretty interesting, particularly right now, is the concept of immunization, right? We can induce active immunity by immunizing people or giving them a vaccination, right? And there are some who have said that things might not go back to normal for us in the face of this coronavirus problem until there is a vaccination out there, because otherwise, as soon as people start to get back together again, we're going to see the spread of the virus. Now, an immunization is where we introduce an antigen to the body on purpose. Now, typically what we're talking about is just like we take a protein off of the chickenpox virus and we put that into your body. So it's not capable of making you sick, right? But your body will see that protein as an antigen. It will mount a primary response. And then if that thing, if that antigen ever shows back up on a real active virus, your body is ready for it and it'll mount that secondary response and get rid of it. And so that's how vaccinations work. There are some that are really have been around forever, not forever, but for a very long time that we get and that are recommended in kids. One of the big ones is like the MMR shot, measles, mumps, rubella. But there's a number of them out there. There's also others that are considered a little bit more optional. But I'm a big time proponent of vaccines. We need them. It helps to make sure that most of our population is immune to certain diseases, and that keeps those diseases from spreading in our population. And of course, being someone who went to med school for a little bit, I'm going to be big on vaccines because basically all doctors believe that we should vaccinate people. The issue is that sometimes people believe that vaccines can cause other problems, right? Some people believe that vaccines will cause the disease, but if the vaccine is made well, it won't. It can't really. And there are others that tie weird things to it. So, for instance, there was a report that came out years ago that autism was tied to vaccination. Well, that has since been completely debunked, but still some people have that belief, right? And sadly, if the right celebrities or different people like that, politicians, get behind that idea, it can really pick up steam. And that happened about 10 years ago, where a lot of people chose not to vaccinate kids and to avoid that MMR shot because they thought it caused autism, which there's no science to back up. Now, kind of fun side note again, this is not stuff for the exam, but hey, the term vaccine comes from the Latin word for cow, right? Vacca. And that's not something that a lot of people know. But the reason that is a fun story. You got a guy named Jenner. Jenner came up with the first vaccine. And what Jenner noticed is that when smallpox was going around, smallpox today is pretty much non-existent, right? But it was a deadly disease back in the 1700s. When smallpox was going around, what Jenner noticed is that women, unfortunately, it was all women who were milkmaids, right? Worked with cows, never got smallpox. And those women who worked with cows got a really mild disease called cowpox. It was a disease that was zoonotic, which means that it can go from animal to human. And cowpox was a really minor thing, kind of caused a cold, maybe a little rash. But these women who had had cowpox were immune to smallpox. And it's because the viruses were so similar that caused those diseases. So what Jenner did in 1796 was he did something that probably was frowned upon, right? So first he intentionally gave people cowpox, which again, maybe not a huge deal because that's not a real severe thing. But then he intentionally exposed them to smallpox, which was super deadly. But he was so confident that it would work, and truly it did. By giving people cowpox, he was able to immunize them against the much deadlier and dangerous smallpox. And so that's how they developed a smallpox vaccine, is they eventually didn't have to give you cowpox. They would just give you some proteins from that virus, but it would then prevent or protect you from smallpox. You can also give people passive immunity by injecting antibodies into them. So also very random side note, but like anti-venom for snake bites, which hopefully you never have to worry about in your life. But anti-venom for snake bites is usually antibodies from livestock. So a lot of things like horses, cows, sheep will actually naturally make antibodies that protect against snake venom in case they were to be bitten. And so we can harvest those from those organisms and actually give those to people to help them if they ever get bit by a venomous snake. And I thought it was funny, in part because people say I look like Jim Halpert, but I like this one, right? You got these moms out there who don't want to vaccinate their kids, and then this is what dad looks like when he knows that he secretly vaccinated his kids. I would say this would be me, but my wife, also being a healthcare worker, is very big on vaccination, so that wouldn't be our family. Now, probably also something you don't have to worry about, but also I think is cool. Antibodies can be used for scientific tools, right? Antibodies bind to stuff. They're like receptors and signaling molecules. And so antibodies will bind to a specific antigen so we can use them in scientific research, right? So when I worked in the Wong lab, developmental neuroscience lab at U of L, when I was a student there and Dr. Wong was a teacher there, we actually used antibodies to tag membrane proteins. We were looking at chicken brains under a microscope, and the way we could kind of make certain proteins light up and be identifiable underneath the microscope was to put an antibody over them. So after getting these brain tissues out onto slides, I would have to basically soak the tissue in these antibody solutions, and then we'd fix them another way, and then we'd look at them under the microscope. Fun at-home example, I don't know about fun, but this is how pregnancy tests actually work. Most pregnancy tests, you guys maybe know this, they're like kind of like a little stick that you have to put urine on. That stick actually has dissolved on it an antibody that will detect human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG, which all of you have in small amounts in your bodies right now, but if you were pregnant, you would have a much larger amount, and it would actually show up in your urine. And so that's how an at-home pregnancy test works. And then I put this picture on here. I can't remember if I've ever said this before. I think he knows this, but I'm not sure. But I think Dr. Wong looks like a Ninja Turtle. If you don't, just think about it a little bit, and then it'll strike you like, wow, he does look like a Ninja Turtle. All right, keeping up with where we are, sort of things that I don't think are going to matter on the AP test, but I've been asked multiple years in this class, what are allergies? And so I figured let's just make a slide about that a couple years back, and so that's what this is there for. Allergies are oftentimes called a hypersensitive response, right? And it's an immune response to a particular type of antigen called an allergen. And now if you're curious, what's an allergen? It's something that is not really pathogenic, right? It's foreign, but your body confuses it for something that could actually cause a disease. So for some of us, it's a plant toxin like poison ivy, right? Some people aren't allergic to poison ivy. If they touch it, it doesn't matter. But that toxin that plant gives off, some people have a reaction to. Other things like pollen right now in the air here in the Ohio Valley, pet dander, which comes off of pets or small animals. All these things can go into your body. You breathe them in, or they touch your skin or whatever. And your body, maybe, depending on who you are, accidentally identifies that as something that's pathogenic. Right? And so what you get is you get this immune response to that when you don't really need one, right? And that immune response usually has an exaggerated histamine release. So what do? You get sneezing, watery eyes, itching on the skin. The lungs might contract a little bit, so it become hard to breathe. You might get a stuffy nose, which you may not have known this. Usually if you feel like you have a stuffy nose, it's not because you've got snot in there. It's because the blood vessels in your nose and in your sinuses have dilated and allowed more blood in there. Or in other words, you kind of have a little bit of swelling inside those nasal passages, and it makes it so you can't breathe. So what do? People with seasonal allergies or a short-term allergic problem, you give them an antihistamine drug, right? Classically, this is something like Benadryl. The downside is Benadryl makes you sleepy, right? So today there's a whole bunch of newer generation antihistamine drugs, things like Zyrtec, Allegra. There's a whole bunch of them, right, that are out there. Now, some people have a really severe allergic response to something. We call this anaphylaxis. And anaphylaxis can cause blood vessels to dilate away from your heart, which reduces your blood pressure if it occurs too strongly. It also causes a major problem of contraction and constriction in the lungs that makes it hard to breathe. And so, again, there are certain allergens that tend to be worse than others for people in terms of anaphylactic response. So things like bee stings, penicillin, and some other medicines, peanuts, a lot of times something like shrimp or something for people can cause anaphylaxis. And when that happens, you need epinephrine, right, or adrenaline. And we'll talk about that later on next week in the endocrine system. But epinephrine will reverse these issues. So some of you guys might have an EpiPen, which is basically a spring-loaded injector that you could inject into somebody's leg muscle to try to give them epinephrine and reverse an anaphylactic response if that would happen. The other creepy thing about allergies is they can come and go, right? So like my aunt was I think about 45 years old and was at a little party and ate some shrimp and had an anaphylactic response to it, had to be rushed to the hospital. And she had eaten shellfish her whole life. And then all of a sudden, that happened to her. And so, I don't want to scare you, but sometimes you can have allergies as a kid that go away. Sometimes you don't have allergies as a kid and they develop as you get older. Last couple things. I don't really think this will show up on the exam either, but autoimmunity, kind of mentioned this earlier. Sometimes what happens is the immune system actually attacks itself. Obviously, that shouldn't happen, but there are diseases that involve this. Lupus is a fairly common disease, which is autoimmune. Tends to cause what's called a malar rash, which is this butterfly kind of shape. That's what they call it. I don't know if it doesn't really look like that, but rash across the face can cause some other things internally that are more serious, though. Rheumatoid arthritis, this is a really serious case, but inflammation of the joints, this is not like old person arthritis. This is just a person of any age is the body's immune system is attacking your joints. MS, multiple sclerosis, is where you have T cells that are attacking your nerve cells. And again, that's not super common, but that would be an autoimmune response. Scientists are pretty sure today that type 1 diabetes is caused by an autoimmune reaction. So the body sort of attacks the pancreas. I think Crohn's disease was mentioned on that earlier slide, which is like a digestive system issue where there's constant inflammation because the immune system attacks it. And then I put this out on here too because it came up a couple times with students. Rejecting an organ transplant seems like the immune system attacking itself, but remember that an organ transplant came from someone else, so that is technically a foreign tissue, and that is kind of right. Your body should attack that. It's just not good for that person when that happens. And then the last thing, if we talk about autoimmunity, we need to talk about immunodeficiency. And immunodeficiency, again, is a topic right now because people who have immune deficiency, meaning the immune system does not work at peak strength, are a little bit more susceptible to infection, and something like this coronavirus issue can be a lot more serious for them. But natural immunodeficiency is common in the very young and the very old, right? So again, right now we got to be careful with babies. We got to be careful with the elderly. Babies haven't had time to develop their adaptive immune system. Elderly people, the immune system just starts to not work as well, and so we have to be really careful around those people when we look at infectious diseases. You can also acquire immunodeficiency though too, right? Sometimes drugs, a side effect of a drug might be this. Cancers will affect the immune system, or the medicines we use to treat cancers will cause the immune system not to work as well. And kind of the best known acquired immunodeficiencies are these two. Something called SID, which is severe combined immunodeficiency, is actually a genetic disorder where you don't really make the B and T cells that you should. And then we've all heard of AIDS, I'm sure, or acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, which is caused by a virus, right? The human immunodeficiency virus, which you see here, kind of on the black line, is over time, HIV viruses will cause the T cell numbers in a person's body to go way down while the HIV concentration goes up, and this obviously can be a deadly combination. Again, this last slide I don't think is real important for the test either. And on the overall, I don't know how specific they would get with this when we are looking at just a couple of free response questions on this year's test, but just in case, we didn't want to ignore it, and so that's our new content for this week. Thanks for listening, and let me know if you have any questions.